It wasn't until I reached my 30s that I realized the mistake we'd made. Although what happened was technically illegal, nobody got hurt. Animals aren't people after all. Only when I began to learn about psychology did Isaiah's behavior actually cause concern. Don't get me wrong, after we made our discovery, I wouldn't have left him alone with an ant. All I'm saying is, it took a long time for me to understand how dangerous the kid truly was. By then, it was too late. Mark, nor any other member of his family, has heard from Isaiah in years. I haven't had a good night's sleep since learning this. I'm sure once I tell all of you what the two of us found in that basement, your sleep might be affected too. First things first, a brief layout of the people involved. None of the names I use here are the actual subjects' names. I don't want innocent people getting harassed. It was 2003, neck deep into the summer. I'm pretty sure it was just after July 4th. Both myself and my best friend Mark were 18. Mark also had a younger brother, Isaiah. He was 12. I'd spent almost every day of the past 10 years hanging out at their house. Things at my house were out of control, but this isn't about my home life. Back on the subject, this specific day was super hot. Even the AC was having trouble keeping up. We decided to retreat to the not often used basement in hopes of a cooler place to hang out. Mark and I remained down there for a few hours. At some point we became restless and decided to dig through the boxes on the surrounding shelves. At the very top of one shelf was a big box lacking any labels. We naturally had to know what was inside. I was a little taller at the time, so I was chosen to climb up and bring it down. Since I was unable to grab it with both hands, I made the stupid decision, depending on how you look at it, to knock it off the shelf. It hit the floor with a dull thud and fell onto its side. That was when the first corpse fell out. We thought it was a hat or something, but when Mark picked it up, it was obviously a dead cat. As soon as he realized this, Mark let out an "ugh" and dropped it. Our curiosity was only stronger then. I grabbed a curtain rod and flipped it over. The poor beast appeared to have had its insides ripped out. After a short discussion, we came to the conclusion that it had crawled into the box and died, only to have a rat come along and feast on its innards. Satisfied with this conclusion, we agreed to continue our search. I pushed the box back onto its bottom and pulled the flaps open to get a better view. It was immediately clear we had far more disgusting discoveries ahead. I would take this moment to warn anyone who is sensitive to these types of situations to stop now. Although I have already described the death of an animal, it's going to get a lot worse from here. With that out of the way, I'll continue. As I said, I opened the flaps of the box only to be met by a menagerie of dead animals. Most were local pets from the look of them. Mark and I were both appalled and confused. What was this? Sheepishly, I reached in and began to pull out the dried husks. In the end, I found 6 different dead animals. Underneath the corpses, the box was filled out with Isaiah's old toys. I pushed it aside and started surveying my ghoulish discovery. 5 out of the 6 were cats, with an additional 1 tiny dog. From what we could tell, they had all been strangled or had their throats cut. I still shiver when I think of it. A few of the cats still had the cord wrapped around their throats. This was all too much for the two of us to handle. Mark was adamant that this wasn't his work. So, we did the only thing we could. Mark walked back upstairs and asked his parents to join us in the basement. They were understandably disgusted at what they saw. Once again, Mark swore he wasn't the culprit. There wasn't any question of his parents' guilt. This only left Isaiah. He was in his room at the time. He was called down. When he saw the box, he automatically looked down. This is a clear indication of his guilt. What followed was an hour-long interrogation. I left soon after it began. This is a family matter. Not to mention my view of Isaiah had drastically changed. The little monster freaked me out. Mark would tell me the specifics later. The decision was made to get Isaiah counseling. And that's it. The police were never contacted. and the pet owners never knew what had happened to their beloved family members. I can understand not wanting your 10-year-old being labeled as a monster, but that's what he was. Mark said he tried to say the animals had attacked him at first and he was just defending himself. Their folks weren't buying that. He eventually accepted responsibility and apologized. I wasn't comfortable with this result as a kid, but now that I know that this is a sign of a serial killer, I'm terrified. For a few years, I lost contact with Mark. I went off to college and moved to a new city. I began searching for him soon after. They had moved to a new city not long after I had. It was a fresh start, as he put it. Apparently, Isaiah had stopped attending counseling within months of starting. He began acting out and residents started asking questions. I knew none of this, of course. When I did track Mark down, I would be updated on everything. Our reunion soon fell under a cloud when Isaiah came up. I could tell by his tone, Mark was worried. In subsequent calls, he admitted he was scared of his brother. Although he was relieved to have lost contact with him, he feared for those around him. As I write this, no one has had contact with Isaiah in over 7 years. His name does come up in searches, but he makes sure to move around a lot. So far, he shows up in Denver, Los Angeles, Chicago, and most recently Long Island. Obviously, these are all cities with unsolved multiple crimes and murders. I'm not sure I'd want to talk to him even if I did track him down. I know Mark doesn't. And now maybe you'll see why my nights are fitful and long. I often blame myself for saying nothing. I catch myself searching crowds for Isaiah's face, but I'll admit I probably wouldn't recognize him now. The hair stands up on my neck anytime a person gets too close to me in a crowd. My fears may be unfounded. Why would he come after me all these years later? Stupid as it sounds, I still feel terrified thinking about him. Somewhere in the world, maybe in a city just like yours, a real-life monster stalks the streets. Am I his next target? Is he reading this right now? Even as I pray for everyone's safety, something tells me someone won't live to see tomorrow. In the name of all that is holy, stay vigilant and beware of strangers. For the last few days, I've been reading about various Reddit members' run-ins with creepers, stalkers, and other downright freaky people. Now that I've gotten good and inspired, I figured I'd add my story to the list. This starts about 5 years ago. My family, consisting of myself, my brother Alec, and of course my mom, were moving around a lot. At this time, my mom was having a hard time finding a full-time job that paid well. On several occasions, we'd been forced to move out in the middle of the night. This would all change when she got on at a well-known lock manufacturer just a city over. The company even provided her with the money to rent a house near the factory, and things were starting to look up for sure. The move proved to be unremarkable, as was our first few weeks in the new place. Despite being nothing special, it was almost paradise to us kids. The neighborhood was a regular working-class area loaded with other kids and plenty of things to keep us busy. Ever since our dad passed when I was about 10, life had been pretty touch and go. But now it was almost like things used to be, at least for a while. During this time, we all did our usual stuff. Mom worked as much as possible, and Alec and I attended school. Then, we started hearing noises. I was the last to notice them. I think Alec mentioned them once, but I wrote them off as nothing. Mom hadn't bothered to say anything for a few days, but one morning at breakfast, we all heard it together. This one resembled a ring chime on a phone. It only happened twice that morning, one after another. We all three began comparing notes and were relieved to know we weren't the only persons hearing things. We agreed it was probably a bird outside. This was not the only sound we'd been noticing, but for the day, we put them out of our minds and began discussing more important goings-on. Nothing else of note would occur this day, but the idea had been brought up. We'd all be far more tuned in and probably wouldn't hesitate to mention anything new in the future. For the next few weeks, one of us would hear a bump on the floor or a scratching sound. We'd make a mental note of it and go on with what we were doing. On weekend mornings when we were all together, we'd mention the week's experiences. We even searched the house once and discovered a small hole leading into the attic. We figured a little critter was going in and out and making some of the sounds. There were still a few sounds that would have been impossible for a rat or squirrel to make. We thought we may have our answer, but some lingering doubts remained. The real trouble started when the food began disappearing. This part of the story affected me specifically. For as long as I can remember, I've had a problem with my weight. I've learned to control it in the years since, but my childhood was made very difficult because of it. This was made worse by my mom. She'd always been thin and beautiful and couldn't understand why I wasn't. When food began disappearing from the kitchen, she blamed it on me. This incident, in addition to a few others, damaged my relationship with my mom so badly, her and I still don't speak that often. But you aren't here to listen to my problems. You want to hear something scary, and that part comes next. I'd estimate we've been living at the new house for around 5 months. Mom and I were barely speaking, and the noises were still an ongoing problem. We'd since decided the house was haunted. Almost a month after covering the hole in the attic and another leading into the basement, the sounds continued. What had once been a strange problem had become frustrating. We'd all had our own issues. Alec himself had been having breathing problems akin to chronic bronchitis. He just started his freshman year of high school and was playing in the school band. He had been up and down with his symptoms. On this particular week, he had been doing well enough to go on a trip out of town. Unfortunately, soon after arriving, his symptoms blew back up and he was sent home for treatment. He arrived back home in the middle of the day when my mom and I weren't around. Things were quiet at first, but soon he heard noises coming from the front bathroom. He called out, but no one answered. Not thinking anything was wrong, he went to the door and opened it. To his horror, a man he didn't know was standing half-dressed, staring at him. He said the man moved toward him. Believing he was going to be attacked, he fled from the house and ran to a neighbor's residence for help. This was where he stayed until the cops completed their search. What they discovered would destroy our newfound sense of peace and cause long-term damage. When I arrived home, Mom was still speaking with the police. My confusion quickly gave way to terror after hearing their story. As they cleared the home, nothing appeared out of the ordinary. That was until they searched the basement. There they discovered a makeshift bedroll under the stairs, hidden behind a large stack of boxes. Although the intruder was gone from what they found, it looked as if though he had been sleeping there for some time. I felt like I had been kicked in the stomach, and I became slightly hysterical for a moment. Once I got myself composed, I asked about Alec. He was still across the street and refused to return home. His hands were shaking and sweat was pouring down his face. A few hours passed and the authorities had all they needed for the time being. We all returned to the house in a vain attempt to move on. The side effects began to show themselves almost immediately. Alec was eventually convinced to return, but he was never the same. Nightmares became a nightly occurrence. He was unable to sleep until Mom or I showed him the basement was empty. Worst of all, his breathing trouble grew worse by the day, and I too was greatly affected. Every minute inside the house made my skin crawl. As for Mom, she said nothing, but the strain showed on her face. Her sleep too had obviously been hindered. With no news of an arrest, we were all drowning in fear. We did all we could think of to comfort each other, but it didn't do any good. At the end of the 7th month, we moved into a new place. This was a 3-bedroom condo without an attic or basement, and I remained there for another 2 years before getting my own place across town. I've been here ever since. After moving from the house, it seems all of our lives have improved. I'm fit, happy, and in a loving relationship. My mom found love with a gentleman from work and they married a year ago. Even poor Alec is doing well. His breathing problems slowly disappeared after the move. Doctors would discover his problems were likely related to the massive amounts of black mold we had been inhaling. After the diagnosis was made, the health department contacted the landlord only to discover the house had been demolished soon after we left. I see this as an admission of guilt. Alec's night terrors gradually lessened with the passage of time, and from what he tells us, he rarely thinks about the incident anymore. I'm not sure he's being totally truthful, but I'm happy to hear it nonetheless. The intruder is still on the loose, as far as I know. He's not even been identified. We'll probably never know the full story. He could have gotten in through an unlocked door or a window. At that point, he could have had a key made for the back door. Our big ring of keys that hung on a hook next to the kitchen wouldn't be hard to find, and from then on, he'd have free reign over the house during the weekdays. He more than likely heard us discuss our plans from his cubby in the basement, and that idea still gives me shivers. He'd be content in knowing when he would come and go safely without fear of being caught. That was until Alec arrived home unexpected. I suppose it's no longer important if he was arrested for his crime. All three of us have moved past the experience for the most part. Any long-term effects have dulled with time. A small thing does arise, however. I do wonder if our intruder has moved on to another basement. It's a part of the home most of us spend little to no time in. Perhaps you reading this are one of these people. Can you be so sure no one is lurking undetected below you, listening to your every word and move? Maybe you should go check, just to be sure.